As human beings, we tend to separate the internal world from the external world. And yet, as Buddhists, we understand the notion of non-duality. We are not separate from our environment. The external world is a reflection of our inner world. As climate change accelerates, what is the role of individuals and of communities? And how can we engage skillfully and with equanimity in a way that is in alignment with our practice? Can science offer effective solutions to heal our planet? And if so, where do we draw the line between science and personal responsibility? To answer these questions, we turn to our moderator for this panel on science, climate change, and ethics. Our moderator is a man who has spent years developing mindfulness-related solutions and approaches to the business community, Birju Pandya.
Thank you. I don't know if we'll have answers, but I think we'll have plenty more questions as the panel wears on. Good morning. Solid. I thought that we would continue the lighter part of this morning's panel topics by discussing the impending effects of climate change. Given the gravity of the topics that we're going to be discussing, I'm particularly grateful that we have this backdrop of mindful practice to be basing our discussion from. As Brian mentioned, my name is Birju. My background that's relevant for this panel as a part of my work is related to funding technological and ecological solutions that would affect and impact climate change. All our panelists here today are here because they have an interest in that relationship between mindful practice and what is going on in our climate. And what is going on in our climate? This is the first time in the story of this civilization that people are looking forward and saying, gosh, I don't know if future generations' lives are going to be better than what we have right now. And there's a lot of folks who are saying the way of life that is being lived in our dominant paradigm, the way of life of this town, as an example, is endemic of the kind of disharmony that we are promoting in the broader whole. So, I mean, this is something that's creating a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty in society at large, certainly my generation and younger, when we think about what's going to happen over time. And the general societal metaphors that we have to address this are not necessarily applicable. You know, there's no house that's burning, and there's no caped crusader who can come in and save us. So, you know, with all of this fight and flight kind of rhetoric that is being put in our way, it's no wonder that it's quite difficult to come across creative, integrative, compassionate solutions that could be implemented by the whole. And my hope is that the point of this panel is to inquire about that and to see what are skillful approaches that we can all grow in our thought, speech, and action as it relates to this topic. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our panelists here, starting with Ken. So Ken Alex has been part of the governor's office, Governor Jerry Brown, for the last 12 years. He's been a climate advisor for California policy, and he is currently at UC Berkeley focused on Project Climate, which is about trying to scale out climate solutions more quickly. Next we have Kate Mundy. Kate is a Theravada Dharma teacher. She's also the founder of the Heart Mind Education Project, and what that does is teach both children and their parents how to engage with mindful practice in their life. The teachings of Buddhism is something that Kate uses to guide her own relationship to climate and teaching the constituencies that she is connected to. And finally, we have Osprey Oriel Lake. Osprey is the founder and the executive director of We Can, which is Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. Her work leads her to the front lines of how climate change is not an abstract numbers thing that you hear about happening in 2050, but something that's happening right now. She is a champion for the rights of nature and of the indigenous. Thank you to each of you for joining us. So I'd love to have a question that's more context setting for each of you in getting us started. I would love to hear, maybe we should just go down and whoever feels called to share. Given your experience, how is the climate conversation connected to mindfulness and mindful practice?
I'll give that a run. First of all, let me really thank the organizers. It's not obvious that climate change should be a part of this conference, and yet the organizers have really brought it to bear and be part of this conversation, which I think is important and really appreciate. And I suppose that's the start of being mindful about how we deal with climate change. So I would say that for climate change and the solution to climate change, there are no shortage of very good solutions to climate change. It's not a technological issue, it's not a scientific issue, it's really not even a financial issue. All of those are barriers and hurdles, but at the end of the day, it's an issue of political will. And we can see that in the United States, we can see it across the world, but in the United States we have an entire political party that denies the basic science of climate change. We have a president who calls it a Chinese hoax. So for me, the concept of mindfulness, and I'll just be brief because we'll come back to these themes, I think. For me, the issue of mindfulness and climate change is if we as individuals and as communities understand the connection between the science and our future and the impacts, then we have a very profound ability to change the political context and then have action that is desperately needed.
Buddhism has a deep relationship with nature, and so I think I'll just start with that, just how mindfulness and this particular topic come together. Most of the teachings, the backdrop of the teachings, there's some nature component. A lot of the awakening stories have some reference to nature as a metaphor or as an inspiration for full awakening. The Buddha, when he would give instructions to people who would come to him saying, "What should I do? Where do I start?" would often say, "Go to the forest, go to the jungle, sit at the base of a tree, and establish mindfulness." I recently was at a retreat in Vallecitos, which is a retreat center in New Mexico, in this gorgeous, wild nature. If you've ever been there, it's striking, and it ends up being one of the teachers. And while I was there, I would visit every day a ponderosa pine that is 700 to 800 years old. And I'd go up to the tree, and you just want to lean into this tree and be in contact with it. And every time I would do this, it was emotional. It would bring in this feeling of connection, this feeling of coming into something that words couldn't touch. And I wonder sometimes if this is something that the Buddha was pointing to when he was asking us to go into the forest, go into solitude with nature. If part of the wisdom behind that was because there was something within the nature that was reflecting our own true nature in those moments. And I know I felt that with this gorgeous ponderosa pine. So I think As far as Buddhism and mindfulness, how does this relate to climate change? I think our deepening of our awareness, the deepening of the unfolding in our hearts and minds depend somewhat on the natural world. And when we are connected to that we start to dissolve the separation that we've been taught. Not that is inherent in our knowledge, but that we've been taught that we are somehow separate from nature itself. And I think through the practice, we can start to dissolve that relationship. And I think that is a starting point for us to fully engage and be inspired to do something about what's happening right now in our world.
Thank you, Kate. Oscar?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the organizers of this conference. I'm really honored to be here. So just continuing the conversation, I'm very much in agreement with the other panelists. I think that the mindfulness component that we're looking at right now, from my perspective, working a lot on the front lines of climate change with women who are impacted first and worst by climate change due to unequal gender norms around the world, as well as indigenous peoples and people of color. These impacts of climate change are very real and very present now. And I agree, it's very much a political will situation. We have what we need to resolve the climate crisis, or certainly not resolve it, but to lessen the worst impacts at this point. I mean, certain trajectories of ecological tipping points are already set into motion, but we could make a huge difference as people mobilize to act. And I agree, it's very much, when we look at root causes, it's very complex and very simple at the same time. I think this dominator worldview that has existed for thousands of years on the earth has really caused a lot of the sense of separation from nature, that we are above nature, that many of the religious thoughts that have existed for some time now have really viewed humans as above nature, men above women, white people above people of color, and all of these hierarchies have been very dangerous to the ecological systems, including putting the economy as above nature versus a subset of the natural world. We should be living within the natural capacity of our Mother Earth and not above that. We are not above nature. We are part of nature. We are part and particle of Mother Earth. So I think that we're talking about massive transformative change if we're really going to address the climate crisis. One of the things I would point out is in the last few years, and especially this last year, young girls like Greta Thunberg, you might have heard of, who has been speaking out since she's 16 now, but she started out when she was 15. All over the world, we're seeing our youth rising up. We're seeing indigenous peoples on the front lines of these impacts rising up because they're literally either facing life and death circumstances every day because of drought or floods or lack of food due to the impacts of climate change already, or the youth are looking ahead and asking us, what kind of world am I going to have? As temperatures are searing in Europe right now, and we here in California had literally the worst wildfire in California history, and 85 people died, within 100 miles of here. So I would say that this relationship to mindfulness is, what is the relationship to our understanding of where we are as human beings as we face literally the existential crisis of our own species, and be mindful of that, and how does that fit into rapid action? What is our responsibility to act as our youth are literally screaming at the top of their lungs for their lives?
Thank you. It speaks to the gravity of what we're talking about here today. I'd love to ask questions that are more for each individual here as we go around. Would love to ask you a question, Ken. You had mentioned the importance of having a political will because there are solutions out there. And we are now at a time, as our previous panelists were saying, that there's a congressman in Ohio whose name is Tim Ryan. He wrote a book called Mindful Nation, talking about the importance of mindfulness in a political context. And I'm curious if you can share your thoughts on what is the importance or the relationship of a mindful process, a mindful nation, to growing political will for big changes to happen.
Nice small question. I work for Jerry Brown, so I suppose that's part of my DNA as well, because he's certainly of that view, and spent time studying Zen Buddhism, among other things, in his callow youth. Mindfulness in the political realm, I mean, it strikes one initially as an oxymoron, but really, what we need is a sense of compassion and empathy that seems to be, at this moment in time in the U.S., to be very hard to come by. And what we need is a rebirth of that, not just compassion for children and families separated at the border, but also recognizing that some of the displacement around the world, and Syria is often cited as the key example, is the result of climate change. And that we're going to see more and more refugees that are fleeing areas that are impacted by climate change. That's the evaluation, not of some left-wing groups, but of the military of the United States. That the biggest military threat that the United States faces, or one of them, is climate change because of the massive displacement that we're already starting to see. Osprey mentioned the fires in California. Obviously, Houston had massive flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. It's the plagues that are coming and that are already here. And so compassion and empathy and mindfulness in politics has to recognize the connection between climate change and the impacts of failure to recognize those connections. And I think that's part of what has to happen for us to act in an appropriate way to deal with climate change in the political realm.
Thank you. I'm listening to you share, and I think about the intersectional nature of this inquiry, right, where climate intersects with social justice issues, et cetera. And I'm listening to what you're sharing and what Osprey's sharing, and I'm just noticing, for me, all kinds of sensations are coming up in terms of the intensity of what we're talking about. And Kate, I'd love to ask you about being in relationship with what comes up as we grow in awareness of a lot of these things where a lot of people may not be even ready to invite in what's coming in at the level of feelings and emotions. I was thinking about another congresswoman named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who a lot of you may know in New York, talking about how most people in her generation are asking a question of whether or not they should have families, not because they're exploring a monastic path, but because they're concerned about if there's going to be a world in the next coming decades. And that's a lot to be holding. There's a grief component that comes into that, and that's not just for people who live in the Maldives or the indigenous people in Alaska, where Osprey was this past week. This is for just folks living in Berkeley as well. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how to be in relationship with the intensive feeling tones that come in as you become more aware of all this, without numbing out or saying, well, it's all not real anyways, or whatever it may be.
There's so much anger that comes up when I hear, what's going on politically, and, different people in power denying that this is even happening, or somehow repressing the way that we can move forward to actually make a difference. Lots of anger comes up. How to turn towards that with tenderness, not feeling like I need to be afraid of that or push it away. but be with it in this relationship in a mindful way. That's where transformation comes. That's where we can take the energy of those emotions, the energy of anger, understand it, transform it into something different maybe. Get in touch with what is it that makes me angry? What is it that makes me overwhelmed? It's because I love this life. I love this world. I love the natural world. I care for my family. I want them to grow and thrive. I want to have clean water and clean air to breathe. I love these things. They're precious. This human life is precious. What do I do now with that energy of love? Not confusion, not of hate, but of love to move forward with that same energy to actually engage and do something.
So there's a woman named Christiana Figueres who was one of the key negotiators of the Paris Agreement, and she has a response directly to what do you do with that anger? And actually, she went through a major crisis as she was working on the Paris Agreement, and consulted with Buddhists to get some help. And where she came to was to turn it into, excuse me, outrage and optimism is how she describes it. And I like that formulation because it allows you to have anger, and I think that's not irrelevant. But it's also the case that there are many reasons to be optimistic. And so I think that's worth keeping in mind.
Thank you. And it speaks to the kind of the opposite approach to the antagonism that seems present in our political dialogues today on this topic. Osprey, I'm curious to ask you, especially considering, I think for a lot of us, the inquiry around climate is an abstract one. We think about numbers, we think about what's going to happen a long time from now. A lot of us may not even think it's going to happen a long time from now. And you have this embodied experience of being in natural states where you feel this and you see this and you touch this. And so I'm curious, for those of us in the audience, I think of this audience as people who've cultivated large capacities to feel what is coming in. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts or reflections on how we may all step into a greater embodiment of our relationship with the natural world, not at the level of going out for a hike, although that's beautiful, but to be able to engage with the disequilibrium that we may not be exposed to just living in the context that we live.
Thank you for that question. I think that's one of the challenging things is the people who are living on the front lines of climate change, meaning heavy droughts, famine, or are already migrating because they can't live in the communities they're living now. Or again, a lot of, it's in the United States, it's all over the world. Many people in developing countries who didn't even contribute the carbon emissions to the atmosphere that we have in the wealthier countries. I think it's really important, and I think this audience and the mindfulness community has a great capacity to put ourselves into the shoes of those who are on the front lines and imagine what is that like. And we know due to economic inequality and racism and issues of, again, around women and misogyny that is all over the world, and patriarchy, that those issues are impacting people right now. And when disasters hit, it is, poor people, it is people of color, it is women that are hurt first and worst. So sort of imagining, what's it like to be in the shoes of people that don't have the privilege to live someplace that's not being impacted right now, or have access to clean water, or who have access to food whenever we want. And so I think it's partly imagining what it's like to be on the front lines. So as one example, our organization spent time at Standing Rock. I'm just using that example because I think people might be familiar with the Dakota Access Pipeline and Indigenous people standing up in North Dakota to stop a fossil fuel pipeline from coming through their territories and the likelihood of destroying their water. Most pipelines leak. At some point they will leak. That's not opinion, that's a fact. And we know Indigenous people stood up very strongly, and a lot of us allies to stand there with them in an Indigenous-led movement that touched the whole world, crying out, water is life, mini wichoni. And hearing those voices, I think, are another way for us to get in touch and to feel embodied and to understand that people are literally fighting for their lives right now, not in the future, but right now. We are on stolen land when we are in the United States, something that people don't like to deal with. So I think that, you know, it's a lot about really looking at the roots, looking at root causes, looking at where we stand. Right now we are in Ohlone territory, and I want to acknowledge the Ohlone people and the Ohlone ancestors. And I think a lot of this has to do with getting very critical, not in a negative way, but really mindful in a critical way to critically analyze, where are we standing? Whose lands are we on? What is happening here? What's my relationship to this place that I am? And really being present with that. In the same way, to be very present with the fact that the trees are dying. The trees around the world are dying because of drought. The waters are being poisoned. We can't eat anything without plastics in it. The fossil fuel industry is extremely powerful in controlling our politics. These are realities that we're dealing with. The United Nations IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, tells us we have about 10 years left. How does that urgency also impact us? You're asking how to embody this. Read the scientific reports. They are telling us that we have a very, very small time frame, an extraordinarily small window to act. And a lot of my hope comes from activity. When you're asking about emotions and where to channel the anger and where to find the optimism, to me, it's in action. And how do we collectively act? Because if we were all to get involved and engaged, we could change this trajectory. That's what our youth, that's what Indigenous people, that's what people on the front lines are telling us, is to stand with them. And even if we're not in the direct line of fire, so to speak, how do we use our privilege to stand with people who are hurting now? Because it's going to take all of us, every community of people around the world, to collectively work together and take action. That's how we're going to change this. So I would suggest just looking at the science and letting that sink in and understanding the small window we have together as a human species to turn this around.
Thank you, Osprey. I want to focus on one element that you said, the hope that comes with action, and maybe zoom it out as a question to each of you three. I have a friend who says what we need right now is for meditators to become active and for activists to get on the cushion, both to happen. And I'm curious, you know, at this stage, when you talk about late stage, you know, that of course invites in this fight or flight response, time's running out, scarcity, and who am I? I'm just one person. So I'm curious from each of your lenses, to the extent you feel called, what do you feel is the role of the individual on something that is unclear, is systemic, it's seemingly impersonal? When we think about, you know, the kinds of solutions being offered to us being, we'll use less straws. And it seems like the kinds of solutions that would be more skillful, even for an individual, may be beyond that.
I'll give it a quick shot. If there's no individual action, we're not going to get where we need to go. And you know, I could say the same about corporate large-scale action as well. I think we need it all. But you know, the emissions are 70% or so are from two sectors: transportation and power. And so if you think about your own life, you can change your relationship to each of those, and you have to. In California, it's actually, by law, we have to reduce our emissions 40% in the next 10 and a half years. That obviously has to be done to significant part at a large scale. We have to change the nature of our transportation system and our power systems. But if you think about your own lives, you can think about over the next 10 years how you do that. And that's going to be a very key part. I mean, you can use public transportation, you can use a non-polluting vehicle, your power sources can change. There are a lot of fairly basic things that all of us not only should do, but are going to be either required or really necessitated. So that's part of it, but there has to be consequences in the political system, in the community system, for failure to take responsibility, to failure to take action. And that's where I think all of us individually and collectively can really change the outcome. So in about 1970, when the environmental movement was just getting underway in the United States, a group of young activists, primarily young, challenged 6 senators, some Republican and some Democrat, and they focused on their failure to act on environmental issues at that time, primarily clean air and clean water. And 4 of those senators lost, not exclusively because of environmental issues, but in part. And the very next day in the United States Congress, there were 100 senators who became environmentalists. So I think that's a lesson for our time. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Others want to reflect, or if not, that's fine.
Sure. I think it has to be personal. You mentioned that sometimes in this movement it feels impersonal, and it has to be personal. I think it does seem when we don't take a deep dive or a close look at this, it seems so big, and it seems like there's all these people who know what's going on, and that they are taking care of it. And what can the individual, how much impact can I really make on a day-to-day basis? And so I think if all of us took time to make this personal and of real true value, like I was talking about, connecting with nature in some deep way and seeing just how much it truly affects each of us. Each of you have had those experiences. Each of you here have had that experience of seeing something within yourself deeply touched from some natural experience being out in nature. Getting in touch with our own impact, that when we, a lot of us have done mindful eating probably in this room. And so sometimes when we do that practice, we look at our food, we smell it, but we sometimes also imagine where this food came from and engage in a gratitude of the journey of that food, who was involved in that process. If we started being engaged in that type of inquiry every time we go to buy a plastic water bottle, or every time we go to use a paper cup, that every time we use a plastic bag, we see the impact of our individual use of that bag, that it hurts, that we feel the dukkha of that connection. That if we're able to make this personal in this way and stay in tuned and in touch with that suffering, I think that what everyone else is talking about in terms of action and what we need to do next, which needs to happen now, I think that each of us individually are more prone to make that jump into whatever happens next.
I feel that if people are in their practice and listen to nature, listen to whatever it is. I don't want to assume I know what everyone listens to, but if we get very present with what is actually happening to our species, what is happening to all the plants and animals in the world, what is happening to the children, what's happening to the Earth's ecosystems, we will know what to do. We will be drawn to what our gifts are. And it's that beautiful alignment of knowing, you know, the fierceness of wanting to live and our children to have a future and to be good humans and have a good life and have the rest of nature be healthy, that we will know what to do. There's so many actions. There's, you know, I could give a laundry list of what you could do and buy and not buy and how much travel and not, and watching your carbon footprint, and all that behavioral change is essential. I'm not saying it's not. But for this transformative moment and the boldness in terms of the time sequence, I think it's a matter of us really deeply feeling and seeing what is happening and then putting our life and energy force behind what actions we're called to do, even if we don't know where it's going. But if we get present with what's really happening, when the house is on fire, if there is a huge fire happening, we would not be in discussion. We would get our bodies up, make sure everyone else was all right, and get out of this building. We wouldn't have to have a plan. We would do it. That's what I'm talking about.
Thank you so much for bringing your humanity. The word transformation really stuck with me. I was once in a gathering where I heard an indigenous woman say, we all have different definitions of what we mean by this word transformation. Some people, when they say transformation, they mean a movement from vanilla to vanilla bean. And others, when they say transformation, they mean vanilla to chocolate. And what I'm saying is vanilla to music. When I think about you bringing your humanity and your experience of 2009 in Copenhagen, and Kate sharing about her son, I'm curious to hear a little bit from you, Ken, on that too. Where is your own personal relationship with this abstract concept of climate change?
Oh, you want me to be personal here? You know, I grew up in Southern California when it was really smoggy. And one of the things that my parents did, we went to National Park every year since I was 2 or 3 years old. And so I have had a deep connection, and I go backpacking and hiking and on a very regular basis. I've had a deep personal connection to nature. My mom is one of the most empathetic people in relation to animals that you can meet. And I think that I've gotten some of that from her. And that's, you know, just been throughout my life, that I feel deeply connected to nature, to the outdoors, to the earth, and the harm that we're doing. You mentioned ponderosas. If you go to the Sierras, there are 150 million dead trees in the Sierras in California. It's stunning. And ponderosas are not long for this earth, unfortunately, because they're right on the gradient between dry and wet. And as we have more drought, they're really at risk. And I have to say, it hurts me, you know, very deeply to see that.
Thank you for sharing. We're almost done with our time. What I'd love to ask before we close is, if y'all just took a breath and said one sentence, what feels essential to share as we close? Anyone can feel?
I'll say inaction can be the most consequential form of action. And because change is inevitable either way, climate change is the most prevalent example of inaction being action. So instead of failing to do something, we need to take it into our own hands.
It's hard to sum it into one sentence, but what comes to mind is that every single person here and those who, of course, are not here matters in this movement. And to get into a close relationship with how you matter in this subject of the global climate crisis, how you matter and what matters to you. Bringing your full attention to that, fully engaging in the suffering that could be felt there, and also your capacity for tenderness and care. And then through that capacity, do something.
How do we respond to urgent crisis and stay very steady and strong in our personal spiritual practices? How do we ensure that we respond to the youth that are calling and the frontline communities, and know that we will bring to those really dire circumstances wisdom that is really needed, and lay down our privilege so that when the house is on fire, we can act in a good way.
We hope that this is the beginning of a dialogue. Really grateful to each of you for taking part.